Hey, this video is the result of some discussions that emerged in the comments sections on a couple of my previous videos, namely part 1 of my The Fuss About Mary's Virginity video and Masturbation and Lust. I've put links to the comments for each of those videos as well as the videos themselves to the right of the screen here. The discussions pertain to what the Apostle Paul had to say about sex, celibacy, virginity, and marriage in the 7th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Paul says that his goal in that chapter is, quote, not to put a restraint upon the Corinthians, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. He also indicates that the counsel he gives to the Corinthians here is consistent with the counsel he's given, quote, in all the churches. As I said in part 1 of my The Fuss About Mary's Virginity video, as well as in a number of comments, it seems quite clear that in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul characterizes marriage as a concession, an indulgence, as opposed to an ideal state. He describes marriage as being for those who, quote, do not have self-control, unquote, and who, if they were to remain single, celibate, would, quote, burn with passion. By contrast, Paul states a clear preference for celibacy and describes it as an ideal or at least better state. Yet I wish that all people were even as I myself am. And how was Paul? Unmarried. To be sure, Paul says that those who marry are not sinning. This isn't about sin. However, the person who marries has opted for a life in which his or her, quote, interests are divided. A life marked by being, quote, concerned about the things of this world and, quote, trouble. By contrast, the unmarried, virgins, and other celibates are, quote, concerned about the things of the Lord and how they may please the Lord. They are, quote, holy both in body and spirit. But Paul's strong preference for celibacy over marriage is perhaps brought into greatest relief when he counsels the fathers of virgin daughters. He says to them, quote, if it must be so, unquote, the virgin daughters may be given in marriage, and the father who gives his virgin daughter in marriage, quote, does well. But the father, quote, who does not give her in marriage will do better. Paul's portrayal of marriage as a state less preferable than celibacy does not comport with the portrayal of marriage that one ordinarily hears believers offer. And in my exchanges with several Christians about 1 Corinthians 7, it quickly became clear that they impose their preference and enthusiasm for marriage on what Paul actually wrote, rather than finding that preference and enthusiasm in what Paul wrote. It's not there, of course. Paul believed it was better to remain unmarried. What I found most interesting about these exchanges with believers was that they were convinced that their argument was with me, rather than with the text of 1 Corinthians 7. One of these exchanges was with a believer who goes by the name Southern Sem. He identified himself as a Christian hedonist who pursues the deepest joys in Christ and in all other blessings he gives, including sex. He also identified himself as one who believes in the inerrancy of the Bible and that the Bible is internally consistent. Excellent. Southern Sem opined that what Paul was doing in 1 Corinthians 7 was writing about, quote, celibacy to those who desire to serve the Lord instead of getting married. Now, it would be easy to note Southern Sem's apparent contrast between getting married and serving the Lord, but I suspect that's not what he meant. His prose just got a bit sloppy. Southern Sem went on to say that Paul's, quote, recommendation about celibacy isn't a matter of better or worse. Isn't a matter of better or worse? It is good for a man not to touch a woman. With respect to marriage, but I say this to you by way of concession. I wish all people were even as I myself am. But I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I am. The unmarried are concerned about the things of the Lord and how they may please the Lord. Virgin daughters may be given in marriage if it must be so, but the father who does not give his virgin daughter in marriage will do better. Folks, this is all about better or worse. I pressed Southern Sem a bit on this, and eventually he revised his position as follows. Quote, Paul is speaking with regards to the mission of reaching the world for Christ. In that aspect, he is saying singleness is better. Here we encounter a familiar move when one has this sort of exchange with some believers. It isn't a matter of better or worse, but it is. If you haven't gotten a copy of this book yet, get your hands on one ASAP to learn the details of what this sort of thing is all about. Southern Sem also said, quote, a concession doesn't mean, in that context, that one is lesser than the other in every sense. Paul is strictly speaking out of his missionary heart here and saying that he wishes more people were equipped, as he, to take the message to other lands. Other lands? Ladies and gentlemen, there's not a single word about taking the message to other lands in 1 Corinthians 7. Southern Sem was just tossing stuff out here rather than simply acknowledging the obvious truth that in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says celibacy is better than marriage. Of course, this doesn't comport with Genesis 2:18. And lots of other verses, but that's for another video. Southern Sem upped the drama. Quote, you make it sound like Paul is degrading marriage. Of course, I never said that. What I said is what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7. Namely, that celibacy is better than marriage. That marriage is a concession for those who lack self-control. As I noted in my The Fuss About Mary's Virginity video, one will never hear 1 Corinthians 7 read at any Christian wedding. It's not an encomium to marriage. Another believer, my comment section friend Halen, said, quote, there's nothing anti-sex there. In fact, it says there's no sin in marriage, and that the one who loses their virginity in marriage does well. Of course, Halen didn't quote the next part about how those who are not given in marriage, those virgins who are not given in marriage, do better. One wonders why believers claim to be so taken with the Bible when they so frequently show themselves willing to ignore or change what it actually says and means. Well, I'm interested in hearing other people's thoughts on this, especially believers. In the meantime, thanks.